Well, we're on chapter 30. It's the last chapter of the book, which means we'll start a new book tomorrow. I'll tell you what it is tomorrow. Chapter 30. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. And then he paused and he turned around and he looked at Charlie with a very serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yeah," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I'm very pleased indeed to hear you say that, and now I'll tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes. And he said, "You see, my dear boy, I've decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you're old enough to run it, the entire factory is going to become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I really am giving it to you. I mean, that's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You're joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But, why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said, "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think I am. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all, so who's going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Somebody's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me, but I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me, won't learn. He'll try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious candy-making secrets while I'm still alive." "So that's why you sent out the golden tickets!" cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one that I like the best at the end of the day, that'd be the winner." "But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "I mean, do you really truly mean that you're giving the whole factory to little Charlie? I mean, after all..." "There's no time for argument," said Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of your family. Charlie's father and mother and anyone else who's around." That's my dryer telling me it's time to fold clothes. "They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie's old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "Yeah, it's over there," he said, pointing. "That little cottage right on the edge of town, the tiny little one." "Oh, I see it," said Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some other buttons and the elevator shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Well, why ever not?" "Because she won't leave Grandpa Josephine and Grandpa Georgine and Grandpa George." "Well, then they'll have to come too." Yeah, but they can't," Charlie said. "They're very old and they haven't been out of bed in 20 years. "Well, then we'll take their bed along with them," said Mr. Wonka. "There's plenty of room in the elevator for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "Oh, you mustn't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "Nothing's impossible. You watch." The elevator was now hovering right over the roof of Charlie Bucket's house. "Well, what are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "Well, I'm going to go right in and fetch him," said Mr. Wonka. "Well, how?" said Grandpa Joe. "Well, through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, and pressing another button. That's my dryer again. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" There it goes again. Oh my gosh. "Stop!" yelled Grandpa Joe. Crash went the elevator, right down through the roof of the house and into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought it was the end of the world. Grandma Georgina fainted. Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth. Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mom, listen to what's happened. We're all going to go back and live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's giving it all to me, and... "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyway." "Who's this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. He took quite a time for Grandpa Joe to explain and for Charlie to help, and everyone to... It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone else what had been happening to them all day, and even then they refused to ride back in the elevator. "I'd rather die in my bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "And so would I," said Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Walker and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, just simply pushed the bed into the elevator, and they pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it, and then they got in themselves. Mr. Walker pressed a button and the doors closed, and Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people down, who were petrified with fear. "Please, don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and you're going to be in the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family's starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." The end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, my favorite book to read. So tomorrow we start a new book, and you'll find out what that is tomorrow.